As I reflect on the past year since we came together in Providence last summer, a lot has happened in our country and world. Wherever you fall on the political spectrum, I believe that we can agree that hate and violence in any form is contrary to the values of Akuho'ai and the housing and residence life profession. Just last week, the Chronicle of Higher Education published an article that indicated that white supremacist propaganda on college campuses in the U.S. rose by 77% last year. Since 2016, that's 478 incidents on 287 campuses in 47 states in the District of Columbia. And that's only the ones that were reported and recorded. We know our students struggle with propaganda, mixed messages, and learning about difference in a way they often never experienced growing up and through high school. Our role as housing and residence life professionals is to help our students grow and learn about others who are different than them and develop cultural competency skills that will serve them while in college and beyond in the professional world. Today, we have invited someone here to share his story as a way for us to better understand influences that we may not have encountered in our own professional and personal lives. While our guest today is an award-winning television producer, author, and peace activist, he wasn't always so well-rounded. Formerly a violent extremist in the white supremacist movement, he left the hate movement he helped create in the 1980s and 90s and began the painstaking process of making amends and rebuilding his life. His work over the past 2 decades after leaving the white supremacist movement has been dedicated to helping others overcome hate and teaching all who are willing to listen about building greater peace through empathy and compassion. Please join me in welcoming Christian Picciolini to the stage to share his story and guide us towards greater understanding of how we can help our students who may be going down a path of hate to find a better way. Christian.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for being here. As Alvin mentioned, recruitment for hate groups and for violent ideologies on college campuses has grown tremendously. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my story, and then I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in the world today as far as this movement and how it's growing. My journey away from violent extremism began 23 years ago, 1995, when I walked away from the American white supremacist skinhead movement that I'd helped build. I was just 22 years old at the time, but I had already spent 8 years, almost all of my formative years, as a member of America's first neo-Nazi skinhead group. But before that, I was a relatively normal kid. My parents are Italian immigrants who came to the United States in the mid-1960s, and when they came to the U.S., they were often the victims of prejudice. They struggled to run a small beauty shop and worked every day, sometimes 7 days a week, 14 hours a day. And growing up, I really missed my parents. I often wondered what I had done to push them away. And I wasn't mature enough or brave enough to be vulnerable and to tell them. So I kept my anger inside. I felt abandoned, I felt worthless, and I felt powerless. So as I grew up with this anger inside of me, I started to act out, mostly because my mother made me wear this outfit. I don't know. Maybe that was why I was radicalized. Anyway, I grew up with a lot of love, but I also grew up really missing parents and guidance, so I was on my own for the first 14 years of my life. But I had a lot of what I call potholes in my life, those little traumas that kind of nudge us off our life's path. Things like abuse or addiction or mental illness, extreme poverty, extreme privilege maybe even. For me, it was abandonment. But we all go through these potholes on our search for identity, community, and purpose, which I think are the #1 drivers for social acceptance. Something we've all gone through, something our children all go to, and certainly something that your students go through. And if we're on this search for identity, community, and purpose, and we hit these potholes, and we don't have the right resources or people around us to help us navigate them, sometimes we get pretty desperately lost. At 14 years old, I was lost. I was standing in an alley one day at 14 in 1987, and I was smoking a joint. And a car came driving up the alley where I was smoking it, and he stopped just a few inches from where I was standing. And when he came out of the car, he had a shaved head, and he wore tall boots, and he walked over to me, and he snatched a joint from my mouth, and he looked me in the eyes, and he said, "That's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile." I have to admit, I was 14. I didn't know what a communist was or what a Jew was. And if I'm being completely honest with you, I didn't really know what the word docile meant either at that time. It's true. But it was as if this man gave me the first lifeline for acceptance. Because after he said that to me, he put his hand on my shoulder and he asked me what my name was, and I told him. And he recognized that it was an Italian last name. And he went on to tell me that my ancestors were great warriors and thinkers and artists. And that much I knew, coming from an Italian background and living in an Italian bubble on the south side of Chicago. But what he said next was what motivated me, because for most of my life growing up, I felt stupid. I didn't think I had the words to explain myself. And he said to me that there were people in this world that wanted to take that pride away from me. And then he would start to name the groups, whether it was the Jews or immigrants or African Americans, though he didn't use those words. And because I felt stupid, I thought that this man had the knowledge, because he was more mature, he was twice my age, that I was seeking. And I'd also felt powerless my whole life for those first 14 years, and then instantly, once I adopted the look and I started to mimic the rhetoric, people began to fear me. In fact, the very people who had bullied me for 14 years. And I had found my identity. And I had joined the first community that I felt a part of. And my purpose, that was given to me through propaganda and through what we're calling fake news now. And I started to believe it. Because when I believed it and when I said it and when I acted on it, I was not afraid anymore. I had been afraid for 14 years. 2 years after I was recruited, when I was 16 years old, the man who recruited me, who happened to be America's first neo-Nazi skinhead, brought it over from England in the mid-1980s. He went to prison for a series of violent crimes, one of which was going to a female skinhead's house, an associate of his, that had been seen at a bus stop with a black man. And he and several of the other older members of our group went to her apartment, and they kicked in her door, and then they pistol whipped her and left her for dead, but not before they painted a swastika on her wall with her own blood. Luckily, they were arrested for that and sent to prison. Unlucky for me, however, I inherited his position because I was essentially the last man standing. By 16, I had learned how to recruit, how to find vulnerable young people who were going through a tough period in their life, and then swoop in and craft a message that seemed like I would be delivering paradise. If that sounds familiar, that's because that's what any type of extremist group does, whether we're talking about ISIS or white supremacist groups or what we're calling white nationalism now, or even cults or gangs. I used fear rhetoric to make people afraid and then draw them in with this sense of brotherhood and protection. for most people who were involved in this movement, they had never had acceptance before, myself included. So what we gave them was this sense of purpose and meaning and family. And the idea, we filled in the blanks of who they were. I ended up leading the organization that I became a part of, which was America's first neo-Nazi skinhead group. And then I started to reach out regionally, and then nationally, and then eventually internationally as I started to make music as propaganda. I knew that music had a very powerful impact on people. I loved music. But my idea was to put racist lyrics to this music, to educate people, to recruit them, also because I understood that music was powerful in building communities and in bringing people together. So in 1991, I made a record and I put it out, telling people through my lyrics to commit acts of violence, to hate other people based on the color of their skin or who they prayed to or who they loved. And in 1992, I took that band to Weimar, Germany to play a concert in front of 4,000 skinheads from all over Europe. This was the first time, however, that I felt the results of my words, that I saw the consequences of what I was asking people to do. Before that, we would play a concert in a basement to friends or to new recruits, but this time, these 4,000 skinheads went out into this beautiful historic town of Weimar, part of former East Germany, and they destroyed it. And I couldn't understand why. Because I had believed most of the time that I'd been involved that I was a humanitarian, if you could believe that. That I was saving the world. And I couldn't understand why people wouldn't listen to me. But now, when I saw the damage and the wanton violence that happened, I started to really question my beliefs and why I was involved in this movement. In fact, because I'm being honest with you, I questioned my beliefs every day that I was involved for 8 years. I wasn't raised that way. My parents weren't racist. It wasn't part of our family DNA. I had to learn it, and I learned it to be accepted. But now that I was accepted, I started to realize that what I was involved in not only was self-destructive, but was destructive to the world. But I wasn't brave enough just yet to walk away. When I came back from Germany, I met a girl. We fell in love. And at 19 years old, we got married and we had our first child. And at 21, we had our second son. And instantly, it started to really challenge my sense of identity, community, and purpose. Was I a hate monger or was I a father and a husband? Was my community the one that I had built around me to boost my own ego and to make me feel this perception of power? Or was it to actually focus on the family I'd given life to? And was my purpose to scorch the earth because I was angry at it? Or was it now to create a positive environment for my family? Unfortunately, even though it was right in front of me, I did not make the right choice. My wife and my children left me. And at that time, I decided that I needed to just take a step back, but I wasn't brave enough to completely walk away. What I ended up doing was instead opening a small record shop to sell racist music. Music that I'd been importing from Europe, and music that now I was a part of making in the United States. And I opened this store, and that music became 75% of my revenue. But because I knew I couldn't have a blatantly open racist store in my community, I had to sell other music like punk rock and hip hop and heavy metal. And of course, I never really expected to connect with those customers, but I was happy to take their money. Until people started to come in over time, and I I started to have small conversations with them. And one day, a black teenager came in that had been in the store several times, whom I'd never spoken to. And that day, he seemed very upset and very sad, and something in me decided to ask him what was wrong, probably more for small talk than anything else. But when he told me that his mother had just been diagnosed with breast cancer, suddenly I could relate to that, because my own mother had been diagnosed with breast cancer. And when I met Jewish people, and gay people, and Asian people, and Muslim people, the story was the same. Suddenly, as I started to talk to them, because I had never in my life had a meaningful dialogue or interaction with these folks, I started to connect with them. And that connection and that dialogue started to destroy the demonization that was happening in my head. And it replaced it with humanization. And suddenly I could not reconcile my prejudices or my racism anymore. I decided to pull the racist music from the inventory, and of course, because it was 75% of my revenue, I had to close the store. I lost this new group of friends that I had bonded with. I also used that opportunity to walk away from the movement. I didn't denounce it. I simply faded away, and I handed over control to somebody else. I didn't have the courage to denounce it. But I had no livelihood. I closed my store. I had no family. My wife and children had left me, and I didn't have a good relationship with my parents at the time, even though they tried. And I walked away from the only family that I had known for 8 years. For the next 5 years after I left, I did my best to treat everybody with compassion and with empathy, but I didn't work so much on myself. I went through a period of depression that lasted 5 years, where there were days where I would wake up wishing that I hadn't. And at the end of that 5 years, one of the few friends that I had came to me, and she said, "You need to change your life because I don't want to see you die." And I asked her what she had in mind, and she said, "Well, I just started working at this computer company. You should go apply there. I'll put in a good word for you." That company was a small one, IBM. You may have heard of it. And I thought she was crazy. I said, "I'm an ex-Nazi. I have tattoos all over my body that still represent my past." I was ashamed. I also went to 6 high schools. I got kicked out of all of them, one of them twice. At that point, I hadn't gone to college, and I certainly didn't own a computer. I thought it was a waste of time. But I went, and I got the interview, and I got the second interview, and then they asked me to do a third interview, and then I got the job. And I was thrilled. It was a job learning how to network computers and install them at large businesses and school districts. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, after my family left, I had hope. Until they told me where I'd be going for my first day of work, of course. I'd be going back to the same high school I'd been kicked out of twice to install all their computers. Suddenly I was terrified. I knew that even though it had been 8 years since I'd been to that school and 5 years since I'd left the movement, that somebody was going to recognize me, that they were going to remember all the awful things that I had done there, the violence and the recruitment, and they would show me the door as soon as I got there, and I would lose that job that gave me hope. But I decided I had to take a chance, and I went in, and of course my first day of work was kind of like my first day of first grade. I was sweating and trembling, and I was scared. Because I knew somebody was going to recognize me. So for the first hour, I kind of lurked around the dark hallways and tried to avoid everybody until I couldn't. And then somebody walked by me that I recognized. It was Mr. Holmes, the old black security guard, who I'd gotten in a fist fight with that got me not only kicked out of that school for the second time, but also led away in handcuffs. He didn't recognize me when he walked by, but I did. I recognized him. I didn't know what to do. But I decided I was going to follow him to the parking lot And as he was getting into his car, I tapped him on the shoulder, not even knowing what I would say to this man who I'd hurt. And when he turned around and he recognized me, he took a step back because he was afraid. And all I could think to do, as afraid as I was to simply say, "I'm sorry." Eventually I found more words and I explained to him what had happened since I'd seen him last, and he extended his hand and I shook it, and we embraced and we cried, and he made me promise one thing. He made me promise that I would tell my story because he recognized this wasn't the story of some kid who was destined for failure. This was the story of a normal kid who got sucked into something that could have been avoided. I didn't know exactly how to do that. I didn't know exactly how to tell my story. I had been trying to outrun it for 5 years. Eventually, as I started to tell people close to me, new friends, they couldn't believe that the person telling them the story was the subject of the story that was being talked about. And suddenly, I started to feel forgiveness. And then I decided I needed to make amends for the things that I had done. And I started to seek out people whom I'd hurt. I finally kept my promise, and for the last 18 years or so, I've been telling my story. And I can tell you that being able to tell my story and to be on this stage, I have to acknowledge my privilege. I know there are people with darker skin than me that would not get this same opportunity. And I hope that I can speak just a little bit for them by telling you my story. Eventually, I wrote a book to do that. And I started speaking at universities and high schools and to nonprofits and community groups. And every time I would speak, somebody would come to me afterwards and say, "I used to be just like you, but I've never been able to talk about it." Or, "I know somebody who could really use your help." I'm happy to say that 23 years later, I've repaired my connections with my crazy Italian family. And I met a wonderful woman who I've been with now for 17 years. And I've rebuilt a relationship with my 2 sons, who are not little babies anymore. And I've tried to be the good father, the positive influence, the empathic listener, the compassionate friend. And I'm happy to say that they're good young men. I'm very proud of them. I also got the opportunity, after almost 20 years of not meeting each other, to reconnect with Mr. Holmes. And all those people in those pictures you just saw saved my life. They had faith in me when I felt the most broken. And all the people that I met at the record store, who I thought I hated, were the ones who showed me compassion at a time when I really deserved it the least, and they were the people I deserved it the least from. They weren't responsible for that. They didn't have to do that, but they did, and I'm so grateful that they did. I want to talk a little bit about what we see happening in the world today. We seem to think that there's a resurgence of white supremacy. I'm sorry to say, it really has never gone away. It's always been there. And when I was a skinhead, we were easy to spot. We had tattoos and shaved heads, and the Klan wore hoods, and they were fringe groups. The internet has changed that. The internet is the #1 place where young people are being recruited. At a time when most young people are spending their time online, that's a pretty scary idea of what's happening. The internet has offered the ability to spread propaganda unfettered. And because there's so much information out there, it's hard to distinguish what is real, what's fake, what's propaganda, what's disinformation, or what's misinformation, which is what we spread around ourselves. 30 years ago, we had a concept of fitting in. We recognized that we were turning away the average white American racist because we were too edgy. So we decided at that time that we needed to grow our hair out and to turn our boots into suits and to go to college campuses to recruit, because we knew that that's where young people were developing new ideas, where they were breaking away from their families for the first time, where maybe they were interacting with people of color for the first time, and they were looking for acceptance. We also decided that we needed to be in the places where we wanted to recruit people, and that was in law enforcement, in the military, and even run for office. Now, I never thought that that would happen. I never thought that this crazy idea would come to fruition. But unfortunately, in the year 2017, we started to recognize this. So what used to be the skinhead is now this. They look like our students, our neighbors, our children, our grandkids, and they've normalized, they've blended in, and they've infected other young people through the use of the internet to try and attract them to this ideology. And I'm very sorry to say that it is becoming one of the largest youth movements that I have ever seen. It also looks like this, like our daughters and our daughters' friends. And it is really beyond what I was involved in. This is now a movement that's influenced both by what I used to believe in, but by extreme voices on the political right who are feeding into this and using the same fear rhetoric that I used to use about building a wall or a Muslim ban or kicking out illegal immigrants and separating them from their families. Those were all talking points that we had in the 80s, 90s. And now they're policy. I want to just talk a minute about the power of the internet. Dylan Roof walked into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and murdered 9 people because of the color of their skin. This is the type of person who is becoming radicalized online, marginalized people with not a lot of friends, who've been bullied, who might have a mental illness that's untreated or undiagnosed, who gets so angry at the world, lands on propaganda on the internet that's falsified, like black on white crime statistics, and then decides to take his martyrdom into his own hands and make himself a hero. Just recently, a friend of mine showed me this post that Dylan Roof had made in a white supremacist forum called Stormfront. And in it, he's talking about a documentary that he had seen. And in this documentary was a band that was singing lyrics that inspired him. It took me 2 or 3 times to read this to recognize that these were lyrics that I wrote 30 years ago. And that what I put out into the world and all those seeds of hate that I planted are still flourishing today. And it's why I do what I do, because I feel responsible. I've also recognized that when I wanted to leave, there was no support system to do that. Years after I left, even though I had lived a new life and I tried to make amends and I was a good person, people still thought I was that evil monster. And I may have been at the time. But what I decided to develop was a system to help people disengage from violent extremism of all sorts. And I do that not by arguing with them, not by telling them they're wrong, not by debating them, but instead I do it by listening. And I listen for those potholes, and then I fill them in. I understand that resilience and self-confidence are what people need, because I never met a confident person in that movement. I never met a person with positive self-esteem. We were all broken, and misery loved company. And we found ourselves in this violent movement because sometimes the only way we could feel good about ourselves was to make somebody feel worse than us. We we hated ourselves and we projected our own self-loathing onto others so that we didn't have to deal with the pain. And making somebody feel worse than we did was sometimes the only way we could feel good about ourselves, or at least perceive it that way. So what I do is I listen for those potholes and then I fill them in. I will connect people who are transitioning out of this movement or have a seed of doubt about the movement, and I help build their resilience. I'll provide them job training or mental health therapy or education or tattoo removal, whatever it is that they need to deal with those potholes to make themselves feel more whole. But I don't stop there. I also challenge their ideology in a non-aggressive way. I introduce them to the people that they think that they hate. Just like I met people and was able to establish a dialogue and an interaction, it gave me the opportunity to see them not by our differences, which frankly are the beauty and the culture and the food and the music, but by the fact that we all need the same things in life. We want to protect our families. We want to be educated and healthy and have a job. And it's amazing that once I help build this resilience, there's no reason to blame the other. I want to just tell you a story about one gentleman that I worked with. This is Daryl. Daryl was 31 years old when he contacted me. He had just been discharged from the military for being wounded in training before he was sent off to Iraq. And he was angry because he wanted to kill Muslims and now he couldn't. He had found a copy of my book and he had read it. And he was, not happy with how it ended. Of course, I left the movement and he was still in it. And he contacted me and I started to talk to him over email and then eventually over phone. And I started to really filter out the noise of everything that I used to say when I was 14 years old and listen to the words that told me what his potholes were. But one day I couldn't ignore the noise anymore, and he said something that really kind of snapped me into action. He said he was in the park with his daughter and his dog, and he saw a Muslim man praying on the ground, and all he wanted to do was go up to him and kick him in the face as he was praying. At that point I said, Daryl, I don't know what you're doing tomorrow, but if you have to take the day off of work, do it, because I'm flying to Buffalo, and we need to sit down and talk. And one of the first questions that I asked him when I got to his home was, have you ever met a Muslim person before? And he said, no. Why would I want to? They're evil. They want to kill me. They hate me. Now, of course, I know that's not true, so I excused myself and I went to the bathroom. And very quietly, I pulled out my phone in the bathroom and I Googled the local mosque. And I called and the imam answered and I said, Imam, I have, a favor to ask you. And he said, sure, anything. I said, I have a really good Christian man here who would love to learn more about your religion. Do you mind if we stop by? I don't usually do it that way. I prepare people, but this time was a pretty, dire circumstance and I knew I needed to do something. So I told Daryl we were going out for lunch. Of course, we weren't going to lunch, and halfway there, I told him we were going to the mosque, and he got physically ill. He was having a panic attack, and he wanted to vomit, and he was sweating, and he was angry. And by the time I calmed him down and I challenged him, I said, Daryl, let's just walk through the door, and if you want to leave after we do that, I'll go with you. But I challenged him, and he accepted. And when we got there and I knocked on the door of the mosque, the imam answered, and he said, thank you for coming, but I've only got 15 minutes. You guys are late. And I said, yeah, I'm sorry. We had to make a pit stop. And I said, we'll take it, whatever you've got. And we went in, and we sat around a table, and 2.5 hours later, after sitting down and having a discussion, we were crying and hugging and very strangely bonding over Chuck Norris for some reason. I don't know why. They really both loved Chuck Norris. He can do anything. I don't know. I'm happy to say that after these conversations had gone on for a while, there's really not a Friday that you can go through their neighborhood in Buffalo and not see them eating falafel together because they're now good friends. Daryl goes to the mosque with his wife to volunteer, to set up chairs. He's still a Christian, but he now understands that the demonization that was in his head was manufactured. I've helped over 200 people at various stages of disengagement from white supremacy and also other types of extremism. And I can tell you that every time when I ask them why they got involved to begin with, the answer that they say is, I was looking for acceptance. I never had it, and they brought me in. And if I ask them the reason why they left, it's always the same. People who didn't have to have compassion for me showed it to me, and it changed my mind. I hadn't seen it before. So I'd like to just leave you with a challenge. Please go find somebody that you feel is undeserving of your empathy and compassion and give it to them. Because I guarantee you, they're the ones who need it the most. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Wow. That's about all I can say right now, though. There are a lot of things racing through my mind. As college campuses become the target for recruitment by violent extremists, it is critical that housing residents like professionals rise up and counter the propaganda to ensure the safety and development of our students.